In the winter of 1881, in a stone farmhouse 12 miles south of Clearfield, Pennsylvania, a man named Thomas Wickham died in a room that had been built specifically for him. The ceiling was 11 feet high. The doorframe had been widened by 2 feet. The bed was constructed from railway timbers because no standard frame could support his weight. Thomas Wickham stood 10 feet, 4 inches tall. His hands were the size of dinner plates. When he walked, the floorboards groaned under footsteps that sounded, according to the farmer's daughter who lived there, like distant thunder rolling through the valley. He had lived on the Brennan farm for 7 years. In all that time, he never appeared in a single census record, no tax document, no county registry, no birth certificate, no immigration manifest. For a man who had to duck through barn doors and whose voice could be heard across 3 acres of open field, Thomas Wickham existed in the official record of Pennsylvania as though he had never drawn breath. But he did exist, and in the final 3 days of his life, as pneumonia filled his lungs and his massive frame finally began to fail, he told the family that had sheltered him things that no one in 1881 should have known. Things about the cities that lay buried 15 feet beneath the streets of Philadelphia. Things about the people who had built them, and things about what had happened to make the ground rise up and swallow an entire civilization in the span of a single generation. 3 days after Thomas Wickham was buried in a 9-foot grave behind the Brennan barn, 2 men arrived from Harrisburg. They carried a writ signed by the governor of Pennsylvania. They demanded to know where the specimen had been interred. They brought shovels. The Brennan family told them nothing, but the men came back in the night, and when the family checked the grave the next morning, they found the soil had been disturbed, samples taken. The earth around the coffin sifted as though someone had been looking for proof that what they'd heard was real. 70 years later, in 1967, a descendant of the Brennan family was renovating the old farmhouse. He pulled down a section of plaster in the upstairs bedroom, the room with the 11-foot ceiling, and found a wooden box hidden between the studs. Inside was a letter, written in 1881, never sent, never opened, preserved in the dark for nearly a century. The letter was written by Elizabeth Brennan, the farmer's daughter, to her sister in Philadelphia. In it, she describes the man they had hidden. The man who had lived in their barn, who had worked their fields at night when no one would see him, who had spoken to her father in a voice like grinding stone about a world that had been erased. And she describes what he said in his final hours, the things he drew on the back of an old land survey map when his voice grew too weak to continue, the prophecy he made about what would happen to the evidence, and the instructions he gave about where to look when the time came to remember. I found that letter in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives in 2019. It was misfiled, uncatalogued, gathering dust in a box marked Miscellaneous Family Correspondence, 1880 to 1890. No one had read it in over 50 years. What it describes changed everything I thought I knew about the buried first floors, the raised streets, the empty graves, and the missing records. Because Thomas Wickham didn't just know about the world that was buried, he had lived in it, and he remembered. Michael Brennan was not a radical. He was a second-generation Irish immigrant who had bought 60 acres of rocky farmland in 1867 with money he'd saved working the railroad. He had a wife, Margaret, and 4 children. He raised dairy cows, kept chickens, grew potatoes and turnips, and attended Mass every Sunday at St. Francis in Clearfield. He was, by every account, an unremarkable man living an unremarkable life in an unremarkable corner of Pennsylvania that no one from the cities ever thought about. But in April of 1874, something happened that made Michael Brennan's life anything but unremarkable. According to Elizabeth Brennan's letter, her father found Thomas Wickham in the woods north of the farm on a morning when the fog was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. He had gone out looking for a cow that had wandered off. What he found instead was a man lying face down in a creek bed, half submerged in cold water, with a wound in his side that looked like it had been made by a rifle ball. At first, Michael thought the man was dead. Then he saw the chest rise, slowly, a breath so deep it displaced the water around him. Michael Brennan stood there in the fog for a long time. He told his daughter years later that the first thing he thought was, "This is not a man, this is something else." But then the figure turned its head, and the eyes that looked back at him were gray, clear, exhausted, and utterly, unmistakably human. The figure spoke. The voice was low, strained, but the words were English. It said, "Please, I can't run anymore." Michael Brennan made a choice that morning that would define the rest of his life. He went back to the farm. He took his draft horse, a sled, and every wool blanket he owned, and he dragged a 10-foot-tall man out of the woods and into his barn before the sun burned off the fog. He told his wife that he'd found an injured drifter, that the man needed shelter, that it would only be for a few days until he healed. It was 7 years before Thomas Wickham left that barn, and by then, It wasn't because he chose to. It was because his body finally gave out. Elizabeth Brennan was 14 years old when Thomas Wickham arrived. She was the oldest of the 4 children, and the only one her father trusted enough to tell the truth. In her letter, she describes the first time she saw him. Her father had sent her to the barn with a plate of bread, cheese, and cold beef. She expected to find a tramp, a Civil War deserter maybe, a man down on his luck. What she found was someone sitting in the corner of the barn with his knees pulled up to his chest because there was no other way he could fit in the space. His head nearly touched the rafters. His hands rested on his knees like 2 slabs of granite. She froze in the doorway. He looked at her. And then he did something she didn't expect. He smiled. It was a sad smile, she wrote. The kind of smile you give someone when you know you're asking them to carry a burden they didn't choose. He said, "You must be Michael's girl. He said you were brave." From that night on, Elizabeth brought him food every evening after supper. And every evening, after her mother and the younger children had gone to bed, her father would take a lantern and a chair out to the barn, and he would sit with Thomas Wickham, and he would listen. Thomas told them things. He told them about the cities he had seen as a young man. Not small towns, not settlements, cities, with buildings made of cut stone that rose 4, 5, 6 stories into the air, with streets paved in something harder than cobblestone that never cracked or sank, even under the weight of wagons, with fountains that ran year-round without pumps, with lights in the streets that burned without oil or flame. He described Philadelphia as it had been in his childhood, a city, he said, that was built on 2 levels. The upper level, where the wealthy lived and conducted business, and the lower level, which he called the old streets, where the working people lived, where his family had lived. He said the lower streets had shops, homes, markets, churches, all of it functional, all of it occupied. And then, sometime in the late 1840s, the ground began to change. He didn't call it a flood, he called it the rising, a slow accumulation of silt and clay that came up from the rivers, from the valleys, from places no one could identify. It happened over years, not days, not weeks, years. At first, people adapted. They built steps down to the old entrances. They raised their thresholds. They dug drainage ditches. But the rising didn't stop. And eventually, the old streets were buried, not destroyed, buried, intact, preserved under 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet of new ground. The city responded by building on top, new streets, new first floors, and the old level, the one Thomas had known as a boy, simply became basements, foundations, forgotten. Elizabeth's letter describes her father asking the question that anyone would ask. Why didn't people talk about it? Why didn't they write it down? Thomas said they did, at first. But then the newspapers stopped printing the stories. The officials stopped acknowledging it, and within a generation, the people who remembered the old streets were dying off, and the ones who replaced them had only ever known the new ground level. He said, "It's easy to forget what you're told didn't happen, especially if forgetting is more convenient than remembering." Michael Brennan was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in tall tales. And he didn't believe Thomas Wickham, not at first. So he asked for proof. Thomas gave him directions to a place in the hills west of the farm. He described a stone archway buried under 15 feet of soil. He said if Michael dug in the right spot, he'd find the top of it, still intact, still carved. Michael rode out the next morning with a shovel. He dug for 3 hours, and at a depth of just over 14 feet, he hit stone. It was an arch, made of fitted blocks, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. It was too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be a mistake. He covered it back up. He rode home, and he never doubted Thomas Wickham again. Thomas told the Brennans that he was not alone, that there had been others like him. Not freaks, not anomalies, simply people who had been born into families where height ran tall. He said that in the world before the Rising, people of his stature were not uncommon. They were builders, craftsmen, laborers. They were the ones who raised the heavy stones, who shaped the arches, who constructed the buildings that still stood, even after the ground had buried their first floors. But after the Rising, everything changed. The new society, the one being built on top of the old streets, had no place for people like him. The doorways were lower, the ceilings were standard, the clothes, the furniture, the tools, all of it was made for people of average height, and the people who didn't fit were quietly pushed out. Not violently, not loudly, just removed. He said that by the 1860s, most of the tall families had moved to the frontier, to places where they could live without drawing attention, where the isolation meant safety. But even there, he said, they were being found. The army had started keeping records, collecting reports, and in some cases, collecting the people themselves. Elizabeth's letter describes her father asking, "Why? Why would they do that?" Thomas said, "Because we remember." And memory is dangerous when the official story depends on forgetting. In the last days of January 1881, Thomas Wickham's health began to fail. The pneumonia came fast. Within 3 days, he could barely stand. Within a week, he couldn't leave the bed Michael had built for him in the barn. Elizabeth brought him water, broth, bread soaked in milk. He ate little. Mostly he slept. But on the night of February 2nd, he woke with sudden clarity. He asked for paper. Elizabeth brought him the back of an old surveyor's map from 1848, and he drew. He drew buildings in cross-section, floors underground, windows below street level, doors that opened into earth. He labeled them with street names: Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. And then he drew something else, a cemetery, not above ground, below it. He wrote next to it, "They buried the dead twice, once in the ground, once when the ground rose." When he was too weak to draw anymore, he spoke. Elizabeth recorded his final words in her letter. She wrote them down exactly as he said them, she noted, because she wanted to remember them perfectly. He said, "They will tell your children that we were never here, that the bones they find are animals, that the old streets are construction errors. They will tell them this for 100 years, maybe more, but the earth keeps better records than men do. When the rivers run low, when the cities dig deeper, when the ground cracks open in the dry summers, the truth will come up, and your people will have to decide whether to look at it or bury it again." He died 3 hours later, just after dawn. The family buried him that same day in a grave they dug together behind the barn, 9 feet long, 4 feet deep. 3 days later, the men from Harrisburg arrived. Elizabeth Brennan never sent the letter to her sister. She kept it. She hid it in the wall of the room where Thomas had died, and there it stayed, sealed in darkness, for 86 years. When it was finally found in 1967, the family debated what to do with it. Some wanted to burn it, some wanted to publish it. In the end, they donated it to the Pennsylvania Historical Society with the condition that it remain in the private collection, undigitized, accessible only by appointment. I found it by accident. I wasn't looking for Thomas Wickham. I was researching something else entirely. But once I read Elizabeth's letter, I couldn't stop. I traced the Brennan family. I found the farm. I found the grave. It's still there, unmarked, overgrown, but if you measure it, it's 9 feet long. I filed requests for the county burial records from 1881. The pages covering January through March are missing. The archive notes they were removed in 1893 for preservation. They were never returned. I found references to government inquiries into unusually tall individuals in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia between 1878 and 1892. In every case, the inquiries came from the Department of War. In most cases, remains were exhumed and transferred to federal custody. None of those remains are in any public collection today. Thomas Wickham was right. They erased the people, they erased the records, and they almost erased the memory. But they didn't bury the buildings, and they didn't bury all the letters. The world Thomas described, the one with cities built 15 feet below the current streets, the one where people like him were common, the one that was slowly swallowed by rising ground, and then written out of history, is still there. You can find it if you know where to look, in the basements that go too deep, in the windows at sidewalk level that open into dirt, in the 9-foot graves behind old barns in Pennsylvania. The truth, like Thomas said, doesn't die. It only waits, and the waiting may be coming to an end.